what I wanted to do, just for the a number of you have been here before, so you sort of know what these are about, and as part of the ongoing series of seminars or lectures on topics in ergonomy, which I have organized, and occasionally have other people come and present on specific topics. And Dr. Sobey had been, the history of it was that we had arranged, I had arranged to do a topic on Reich's scientific work, which I did not feel qualified to do a formal presentation on, and asked Dr. Sobey if he had any ideas, and he shocked me by saying, well, why don't you ask me, which I had never considered doing, given his prior resistance to public speaking. But anyway, that started the series of lectures that he did, 3 that he did on various topics of his choosing, which were more than anything else an opportunity to just get him to speak and put down some of his thoughts and feelings and responses to the historical and personal connection with Reich and with the aftermath of the Reich era. And he was scheduled, before he became ill, to do another lecture last spring, and the last time I spoke to him about it, he said the same thing that he had said every one of these lectures is, there's no way I'm doing this again. Which was, if those of you who were here, he would say, this is ridiculous, and he would always tell me that he was very angry at me for forcing him into it. And then afterwards, when it was over and he sort of enjoyed the whole interaction, he wanted to know when he could do it again, when we could do it again. But unfortunately, the 4th one didn't happen. So after his death, and in thinking about it, I felt that in some way a fitting sort of resolution to that activity was to do some sort of gathering or around his work. This is, and as I told people, this is not intended in any way to be a memorial to him. We had a memorial after his death. This was really, in a sense, at least for myself, an attempt to place some historical frame around someone who I felt was an exceptional scientist, an exceptional clinician, and a great teacher for me, as I think many of us would agree. So what I wanted to do is just sort of place it in his work in terms of some of the basics of his life, such as I could piece together. One of the things is Dr. Sobey would joke that he had sort of cursed me with saying that since I had an historical bent, that he would make me his historian. And that was sort of, an honor, except if anyone who knows Dr. Sobey knows how difficult it was to get him to really give you exact historical and narrative references. But if you spend time with him and let him talk, a lot of it would emerge. So much of what I would have to say comes from the pieces I've sort of pulled out over the years, and certainly I think if anybody has other recollections of it, Dr. Weitzner is here, who, along with myself and Dr. Harold Schwartz and 2 or 3 others, Edward Applebaum and Ken Bremer, who was still one of the 2 or 3 living members of the group around Reich, who lives up in Woodstock now, attended seminars and training work with Dr. Sobey. So there could be some comments that Dr. Weitzman might want to make based on our interactions and sense of what Sobey was doing over those years. And anyone else who would choose to add anything is certainly welcome to do so. Let me start with a couple of just basic facts so you get a sense of the moments in his life. He was born in, and he always liked to talk about that, in a small, I think it's pronounced Solvay, New York, near Syracuse. It's basically a suburb of Syracuse. his mother ran a general store or some sort, and he was never quite clear what it was. He sometimes said it was sort of a general store, other times it was just sort of a store. I mean, his Wendy Sobey, his daughter, is here. Maybe she has a clearer sense of exactly what. It was in every, right, that was the sense I got. It was everything, anything that you could make a little money at and keep going. But he used to like to tell me stories about the fact that most of the time, except in the winter, that he didn't wear shoes for many years. And it was sort of a sense of growing up in a very rural environment. He went from there to, obviously, by circumstance and choice, to Syracuse University, remained a committed Syracuse fan of all Syracuse. He was a big athlete, athletics, and he actually played football there. It's hard to imagine. I mean, I can imagine him physically playing football in terms of his own. I don't know that he had a great career in football, but he played football. And after, and there, one of the great anecdotes, just let me quickly tell, if anybody doesn't know what the M in what the manual in Victor Manuel Sobey is, for me, one of the great Dr. Sobey stories. He never had a middle name, and he got to Syracuse, and being this kid from the country, and he was online for his first registration, and he noticed all these other kids there signing up, and they all had middle names, and on the application it said middle name, so he became panicked because he assumed that you had to have a middle name, and he was convinced that if he didn't have a middle name, somehow his registration would be completely. So he desperately tried to figure out a middle name, and his eyes fell on a registration manual. So he said, well, my middle name is Manuel. And that was the manual. And it stayed with him. And after Syracuse, went to medical school. He graduated in 1943, went into the Army, and upon graduation from the Army, went into residency training at about 1946 in New Jersey at a veterans hospital there. And it's in that sense where the connection with Reich really starts. And as Dr. Sobey always said, that had he not, he felt that after his residence, after his medical school and residency, he had physically about 10 years left in his life in terms of the condition he was in, and that the connection with Reich really changed his whole perspective. It was absolutely, what's clear from everything he would ever say was it was a defining moment in his life. So on that, with that, I'd like to, if David can start it, just play a little bit of the one remaining fragment of an interview. I've told some of you the story about this. I finally got Dr. Sobey to sit down to start recording his memories, and someone had given me a tape recorder that was supposed to be a really good small tape recorder that he had found. I should have known something that he had found on a plane and wasn't working, and he had fixed, and it was working perfectly. And I tested it out for a few minutes, and it was fine. Unbeknownst to us, it had a capacity of going for about 15 minutes and then stopping. I never got up to that until we did this tape. So the tape was only 10, 15 minutes. But David, if you can start that. This is essentially the beginning of just asking Dr. You might not hear it. I asked him if he could just describe how he found out about Reich and his first meeting with Reich, and then I'll fill in the final answer, which sort of fades out.
Dr. Victor M. Sobey being interviewed by Harry Lewis regarding his years with Dr. Wilhelm Reich.
Okay. I just wanted to ask you to tell me when and how you met Dr. Reich.
Following Dr. Reich's work.
My first introduction to Dr. Wilhelm Reich was approximately the fall of Dr. Ellsworth Baker, Dr. Duval, Dr. Cobb, Dr. Rayfield, and several psychologists who had become very interested in what I'm writing. In fact, Dr. Baker, Rayfield, and Duval had already begun training and treatment with Dr. Rock. Dr. Degrove came to the hospital with a stack of books, all written by Glenn Wright. And he was raving about Glenn Wright, how he had advanced and brought Freud's psychoanalysis on a more biological basis. The books at that time were Character Analysis, Functional Orgasm, Sexual Revolution, Mass Psychology of Fascism. The residents of whom there were about 10 in number, older men, by that I mean had graduated med school at least 6-7 years prior, but were deferred from the residency because of being in World War II. We had all been doing psychiatry of the day, psychoanalysis, and had been exposed to the leaders of psychiatry in the army. Interestingly enough, all of us were pretty well fed up with the theories of psychiatry at that time, including psychoanalysis. So we looked at Dr. Wright's book, and we were impressed with character analysis and the function of the orgasm, but as one would expect, we sort of was quite skeptical of the orgone energy concept. Accumulators, call it the vegetable box, we call it vegetable therapy, but we, at the same time, we couldn't reject his theories and treatment that he described in the book.
Make too much sense.
Huh?
Make too much sense.
Made no sense. At that time, we were taking courses at the New York Psychoanalytical, and our lecture psychoanalyst was a man by the name of Dr. Shiyatsky. And we were discussing Dr. X's work in character analysis, orgone among ourselves. In one session we came in and asked Dr. Shiyatsky if he had ever heard of William Wright. Well, we thought, we asked him if he ever met Hitler. He immediately expounded with the most vitriolic, pejorative words about any doctor I ever heard. And one woman there, psychoanalyst with a very good reputation, Margaret Freeds, who was quite open, but at the same time, not as negative, but at the same time sort of said, well, I'm not sure that he has all his marbles there, but his character analysis is quite good. Which was something because at that particular time, 1946-47, character analysis was still on a bad list. So we that was in the spring of 47, and then the summer vacation came. I had read more of the books. And about 3 or 4 of the doctors went over and made an appointment with Dr. Wright. Somehow or other, I don't know why I didn't have the time at that particular time. And they came back. They were very impressed with him. And several of them said that they didn't want to make a lot of money, they would have more contact with Dr. Wright. And 2 of the 4 applied to the New York Psychoanalytic Code and became psychoanalysts. The other 2 sort of dilly-dally. And then December of that year, 47, I wrote, in November, I wrote a letter to Dr. Wright saying that I was getting briefed through my curriculum vitae, and I said, it seems like his work has filled in a void of psychoanalysis. He wrote back and said he didn't fit in any void. With the help of Freud, he went out to discover his energy concept. He gave me an appointment. And I went there, and I remember very clearly, it was December 6, 1947. It was a fantastic snowstorm. And when I came off the subway and walked from the subway all the way to where we lived near the tennis courts, where they held the national tennis. And I met him, remembered him, and I was immediately quite impressed with his stature, his appearance, and his openness and forthrightness.
Was he taller than you or short? I mean, everyone always talks about different people.
Yeah, well, at that time, our first meeting
the answer was, at his first meeting, he thought he was very, very big. He had a feeling, and this is, I was telling James Frick, who's a historian and scholar of orgonomy, Reich's work, and a biologist who's sitting here, that I've had, and Wendy's over, we were just talking, I was saying, I've had this sort of ongoing, sort of personal, historical data collection of people's impressions, people who met Reich. Every time I encounter someone who actually knew Reich or met Reich, I ask them about his size, how he looked, and there has not been one consistent answer. And I used to talk with Dr. Sobey about this. He said, yeah, because it depended on what you were projecting onto Reich. A lot of people saw him as this gigantic figure that was sort of looming over everything, and others saw him as this sort of, small. In fact, historically, he was evidently about Dr. Sobey's size. He was about 5'4" or something of that sort. On the other hand, a couple of people talk about the fact that Reich also was capable of positioning himself in ways to create a sense of himself as a little bit, he had a sense of showmanship at times, in terms of his ability of presentation. At any rate, Dr. Sobey spent another hour or so talking. Unbeknownst to us, we didn't know that the tape was basically to describe that Reich essentially wanted to know why any young person like himself who was just finishing medical school and doing residency, why he would be crazy enough to get involved with Reich. And the line, which I was, is Dr. Sobey comments on the fact that these guys said that if they were not interested in making money, they would have gotten involved with Reich, and that was an ongoing thing. Underneath that was also that if you worked with Reich, Reich had a very, very strict policy about fees. You were not allowed to charge more than a particular fee, and if you wanted to increase your fees or change your financial relationship with patients, you had to get Reich's permission. And he had a very strict policy of keeping fees moderate, feeling that the higher the fees, the more it pushed people out of treatment. He also, according to Dr. Sobey, was never very much in favor of second or third party payments. Second party payments being payments by parents or friends. And so in those days there weren't really many third party payments, but to the extent that there were, he felt that patients should pay a fee that was just enough of an effort to generate a serious indication of their involvement. And Dr. Sobey often said that Reich could get irate if he heard that people he was training were increasing their fees or trying to make, a lot of extra money. One of the things that evidently drove Reich really crazy was the feeling that people came to study with him as a way of getting a line on making a lot of money. So again, Dr. Sobey talked a lot about that in this particular tape that never came finished, but also talked about the fact that once it was decided that Dr. Sobey was serious about working with him, Reich took him quite seriously, started treatment, and Dr. Sobey entered training along with the group that he mentioned. And it was a fairly extensive group. I think one of the things that historically becomes very important to take note of, especially since orgonomy and Reich's work tends to become more and more obscured and less even known or engaged, is that there was an incredible amount of interest. I think what is often missed if you don't talk to people who were there is very much what you hear on this tape, which is a sense of younger or people who are coming back from the war or back into a social engagement, with a sense that a lot of the answers that had existed before the war just were not adequate, and they were looking for new responses, there was a great deal of enthusiasm and interest. And I think the sense that I've gotten overall over the years from many different angles is that Reich was extremely attractive figure and drew a great deal of attention. His lectures at the New School were standing room only at all times, and the requests for visits, treatment, his invitations to parties, and one of the things his commented often was invited to all these parties to become sort of the guest of honor, and after a while didn't want to do that, and often didn't play to the right people in terms of getting the kinds of attention, but that many young people from all sorts of areas, not just doctors, teachers, social workers, psychologists, artists, intellectuals, were really very, very drawn to the work, and it was a very thriving and active community, which sort of belies the fact, goes against the fact of the presentation of the external scene, particularly in psychoanalysis or in traditional psychiatry, that this was a fringe group that had only a bunch of weirdos who were interested, and this is really not the historical sense that I get. And I'm not only talking to people who were involved in orgonomy with Dr. Sobey, but really other people who were not particularly interested in Reich would just describe what people I talked to at the New School who remembered that time. There was a great deal of dynamic and energy around the whole thing. And I think that's something that in the years I talked to Dr. Sobey, I think was always communicated, the sense of real excitement, and along with that, the excitement of going into the laboratory, not just in terms of treatment, but actually the seminars, the meetings were really bustling with a lot of creative energy and a lot of different people that were drawn to it. The years that Dr. Sobey spent with Reich, essentially in training and in therapy, one of the things he said that was difficult for him to talk in great detail about the specifics of his work with Reich is that it was always very hard to separate your own, especially for the younger doctors who were working with him, it was always very hard to separate your work with him from your treatment with him, so that to talk about very often a lot of what was going on in terms of his own personal life also intertwined with the years that he was working with Reich. So he was very clear about the fact there was some reticence to talk, about his personal life, and that it was all very, very clearly intertwined. It was the centerpiece of his life. And he remained with Reich until the end and became, in the last year or so, basically the treasurer of the defense fund and sort of an assistant to Reich, such as it was. And essentially during those days, Dr. Sobey described the fact that most of the active clinical practice and scientific work began to stop, and much in the last couple of years was focused on defense work and trying to keep things going, keep the literature alive. And of course, with the final trial and Reich's death in jail, Sobey was the key figure in having to dismantle the physical apparatus of the work, meaning literally the publications that were stored at his house and at his office, and many of the accumulators and other devices and scientific equipment had to be, under the marshal's orders, destroyed. And one of the last things, I think at the lecture, Dr. Sobey talked about that, and that same quality comes through when Dr. Sobey talked of Reich in saying that he mentioned there, and he says that Reich writes back, I didn't fill in the gap of anybody. I worked directly from Freud's work and went on. Again, the sense that when Dr. Sobey was angry at the marshals at one point and wanted to, tell them off and tell them where, how wrong they were, that Reich, shortly before his death, said, there's nothing. These guys are just doing their job. They don't really understand what's going on here. There's no need to have a fight with them. Just do your work. And that became, for me, if I had to pick one specific thing that Dr. Sobey always emphasized, I think to all of us, was that the issue was doing your work. To the extent that orgonomy had any meaning, or Reich work had any meaning, was the last thing he talked about with Reich, one of the last things that Reich said to him was, don't build any institutions. Just go out, do the work as best you can, carry it on. If you're capable of passing it on to a few individuals, fine. And let the rest of it take care of itself. And he held very, very, in my sense of him, he held very, very strongly to that. Did not have a great deal of faith in larger institutions, was always somewhat skeptical about them. Sometimes he would be joking about them, sometimes he would be irritated about them, but basically felt that, you just sort of did the best you could and kept the work going. For many years after Reich's death, he did do that. But he and a number of the others, right after Reich's death, they kept the organization as such, the organization of the clinicians, the ergonomists, the medical ergonomists, together as a group. During that time, it depends on who you talk to, unbeknownst to the major body of the group of ergonomists that were meeting regularly, Ellsworth Baker, who had been one of the key assistants to Reich, associates of Reich, was organizing another group, which has now subsequently become the American College of Orgonomy. When that came about, Dr. Sobey and Dr. Handelman, who was Dr. Sobey's partner, office partner, were asked to join that group, and they declined. They remained associated loosely with the remaining group, which was largely centered around themselves. I think Dr. Gold, a few other people, and chiefly Dr. Rayfield, Chester Rayfield, who was also a close associate and colleague of Dr. Reich, who was still alive. He's probably one of the 2 or 3. I was just talking with someone trying to figure out how many of the original group around Reich are still alive. It's about 3 or 4, depending on how you. But of the few that were actually fully trained and involved with Reich, I think it is only Dr. Rayfield. Is Dr. Gold? I'm not sure if Dr. Gold is still alive.
Franz Oliver.
Oliver, yeah, they say I don't.
Sobey told me a few years ago that Oliver had Alzheimer's.
Yeah.
Nursing home.
It's possible, and also and Nathan Cott, Dr. Cott, the vitamin doctor, was also a close and trained. He left the work with Reich's, very good wishes, and always remained. And to this day, when I've spoke to people who've met him, always speaks highly of his involvement with Reich. And then there were a number of other younger people, like Dr. Rothenberg, Michael Rothenberg, who had been closely associated with Reich, but had not become a doctor at that point. He was in medical school when most of this happened. But had a lot of training and contact with Reich. And there's Dr. Kenneth Bremer, who worked with Reich and had contact with Reich, but wasn't actively trained by him. So there are just a few remaining individuals, and certainly it's really Dr. Rayfield who remains the one primary figure who was closely associated with Reich. At that point, these 2 factions developed, and Dr. Sobey and Dr. Handelman made a very clear decision to be involved in none of it. I mean, they basically just went off and set up their own, continued their own practice. Dr. Handelman tended to remain more removed from any kind of training. He just did his own work and associated with Dr. Sobey, but did no training. Dr. Sobey continued to do laboratory work, which was very significant. He kept an active laboratory going in his office, pretty much as far as I can tell, although he was never 100% clear when he stopped, roughly around 1965. The reason for stopping primarily was the time-consuming. He did the blood work, and he also did a lot of the other kinds of preparations and demonstrations, and trained a number of the younger doctors from all the various groups who were coming and studying orgonomy. But he primarily found that, one, it was a huge time-consuming effort. They were also beginning to get inquiries in their building over on 10th Street about what was going on there, since there were issues about maintaining a laboratory in terms of health regulations and other such things, and the money, which is very expensive to keep it up. So for various reasons, he stopped in about 1965, although he kept a fairly active interest in it. And then in around 1978 or 79, he decided to begin to train a few individuals. And the primary group was myself, Dr. Weitzner, Dr. Schwarz, and then more peripherally, Dr. Applebaum, and that was pretty much it. A few other people attended the seminars. For a while, there was a meeting between the seminar that Dr. Sobey was running and some of the people that were working with Dr. Rayfield, who was also training a few orgonomists. That lasted about a year and then sort of just faded. Dr. Weitzman was more involved in that seminar than I was. And the sense was that it brought up, the sense that I got, and maybe Dr. Weitzman could comment on that, was that it brought up old rivalries or old issues between Dr. Sobey and Dr. Rayfield as to who was senior. Dr. Sobey being the youngest of all the guys that was trained. And interestingly, anecdotally, he often felt that when Baker and Rayfield had been very, very close during the years while Reich was alive, they often tended to tease and cut out a lot of the younger guys, and so that afterwards, a lot of these sibling rivalries broke through, and in a sense, without Daddy there to sort of keep things going, that there were these issues that never got quite resolved. But nonetheless, that seminar continued with Dr. Sobey pretty much until about the last year or two of his life, when he just got too tired and there wasn't enough of a group left. But I continued to meet with him regularly, and there was always something to learn. And much of what I've pieced together about his activities comes from his way of teaching, which was basically to talk about a specific problem, and in the process reminisce or discuss things that he remembered, that he had learned from Reich, or that he had observed over the years. One of the anecdotes I found always very interesting is he said that, which I thought was a very interesting comment on the way things get reconstructed after the death of a major Promethean figure like Reich, which was that Dr. Sobey said that often at meetings that he and Dr. Handelman would often say, well, Dr. Reich said, or when Dr. Reich wrote in this book, and he said a lot of the other guys started saying, why do you always have to keep quoting Reich? We got to move on. And Dr. Sobey always said that he would say, until I find something that's better or that makes more sense, there's no reason not to quote Reich. If it's useful and valuable, that's where we keep it. And that was for me, I think the main line of what Dr. Sobey would teach and emphasize was constantly going back to the original work. And at the centerpiece, one of the things Dr. Sobey always pointed out was that orgonomy was not psychology. And that at the center of this was the issue of orgone energy. And that if orgone energy was genuine, and if Reich had genuinely discovered something, and if Reich's ideas or insights or knowledge was genuine, then orgonomy had a very, very valid and important function. If in fact, not that it would necessarily survive or succeed, but that it was genuine. If not, then it was just another sideline in history. For him, the central issue was always the energy, the movement of energy. And he would love to quote, as I think everybody who was either in treatment with him or studied with him knew, the line that he always took from Reich, which is that it doesn't matter, if standing on your head and wiggling your toes got the energy moving, that was what you do. It didn't really make, none of the rest of it really mattered. All the rest of it was techniques. It wasn't about banging on the couch. It wasn't about, breathing. It wasn't about yelling, screaming, crying. It was about getting the energy moving. All these other things were simply means for doing that one learned or used. And he would always say you could do it psychoanalytically if you could do it. There's nothing wrong with that. You could do it by sitting and talking. You could do it teaching in a classroom. You could do it in any number of ways. If you got the energy moving, if you could establish the orgasm reflex or get as close to it as you possibly could, then you were doing orgonomy. Then he would usually say, I think more towards the end of his work, that he wasn't sure that any of us did orgonomy anymore. That it's possible that nobody did orgonomy after Reich died. And then sometimes when he was a little more, I think, pessimistic, he would sometimes say he was not sure that anybody did orgonomy except Reich. But usually he had a more up-tempo feeling about that. He felt that what happened after Reich's death was consistent with Reich's concept that essentially after he died, there would be feuding and fighting as individuals tried to establish that they had a piece of the truth, or they had the truth, and would establish factions, and that in fact most of this was more a reflection of the character structures of the individuals who saw the necessity of containing the truth or holding the truth or having the truth, and that none of it would serve orgonomy. In the last years that I knew him, he felt the most important thing that you could do for ergonomy, which is what I think the emphasis here is, in terms of whatever money we collect today, is to give as much money as possible to particularly the publication of Reich's works, keeping them published, keeping them available, keeping them out there. Was of great value only to the extent that if in future people became really interested, and he also commented often on how you would see these swings. He said, now nobody even knows Reich, or a lot of people aren't interested, or they dismiss him. He said all of a sudden, for reasons that have nothing to do with Reich or anything else, 10 years from now, Reich could be the hottest topic, around. He said, these will come and go depending on what else is going on in the world. But the main thing is to keep the work active and available. And that was, and he donated as much as he could when he could to Organon, particularly to maintaining the publication of orgonomic functionalism and other works specific to Reich's writings and studies. And I think that was a primary focus, always coming back to what Reich had done. And we kept the little bits and pieces of what was remaining from the old library and the old publications around. But Dr. Sobey was not exactly an archivist, if anyone knew him. So he would sort of, every once in a while in the office, he would say, I found this, and he'd give me a little piece of paper that was a note from Reich, or a piece of this or a piece of that. It wasn't exactly well organized, so it was very hard sometimes to know exactly what was left. Anyway, but the main sense was that most of what the center of the work was not going to be able to be really touched, because he felt that the character structures of most of the people that were coming to the work from a professional point of view were not really able to fully grasp the significance of the energy concept and to work with it as the center of the work. And I think he felt that very much in some ways, I don't think he was necessarily pessimistic, but I think he felt very, very much consistent with the little tape that you should all hear if you haven't at some point, that was been released by the museum, the Reich Museum, called Alone at Organon, which is Wilhelm Reich just making a brief statement about his position towards the end of his career when he was alone, sort of very poignant. He turns on the tape recorder and just records some of his feelings and observations about where he's at. We have it. If people would like to hear it, we could play it. It's a very poignant moment. And I think Dr. Sobey would have, the tape came out after he died, but I think he would have been very, very much in agreement in his sense of Reich's position on this tape was correct. I think possibly maybe what we can do is at the end, just as we started with Dr. Sobey, maybe we can listen to Reich. But the sense, one of the last things Dr. Sobey said to me, he said, I think he said this a couple times to all of us, he said that he felt in some ways that maybe orgonomy and Reich's work would benefit when all the old guys who had been around and connected with him were gone. And sort of, as long as the work, the writings sort of stayed available, that maybe younger people would begin to come to it with a freshness and a kind of enthusiasm if they found it in a way that the old people who had different grudges and different keys and different axes to grind were no longer around. I'm not sure, but I think, if anything, I guess for me, the one quality that was unique about Dr. Sobey, both as a practitioner and as a teacher, was even though he was at times cynical and somewhat, dismissing of certain kinds of enthusiasms, I think he had a certain optimism. He insisted until the end in every conversation I had that things were getting better all the time. That he felt that the basic scene, no matter how dismal it got, no matter how chaotic the world became, that it was essentially a sign of progress. And that went back to the basic concepts of Reich. Again, the whole concept of, he talked very, very often about this, that the idea of the third layer, which was the restrictive armoring, both socially and physically, in the organism. The secondary layer, which breaks through and all chaos breaks loose, but that the goal always underlying it was the primary biological pulsation. And he felt that what you were seeing in the world today was the breakthrough of the secondary layer and chaos. And he said, I think at the last lecture he commented how Reich would say that many innocents would be lost, in the process of this kind of chaotic, upheaval, but that out of this a sense of more genuine natural function would emerge. And then on the other hand, he would say, well, I'm not going to be around to see it, so I might as well feel that that's the future rather than see a pessimistic, dismal end to things. And the other, and he remained that way pretty much in my interactions with him to the end. Last couple conversations I had with him, even though he knew he was dying and was quite ill, he was still basically, when he would talk about those things, would still basically come back to those kinds of primary issues. And that, again, since then, based on the training in the seminar that he ran, I think that those were the things that he emphasized, that the discovery of the orgone was the major event, the center of it all. Clinically, the basis of practice and overall technique was energy and its metabolism, getting it moving. And that everything else was technique, and whatever worked to get the organism functioning fully as possible was okay. And that to avoid, and that it's hoped that eventually the factionalism that existed would somehow stop getting in the way of people trying to deal seriously with the work. And then one of the things that he said was he felt that the factionalism that existed among the few individuals who were involved or interested in his work did more to kill orgonomy and Reich's work than the FDA or any other organization.
Yeah, I'd like to make some
Yeah.
comments, but I can't stay till the end.
Right. This is Dr. White's doing it.
I'll make some comments about the seminar because you specifically mentioned it. But I wanted to say first that I absolutely agree with you. This was Dr. Sobey's conception of the main task of orgone therapy. But when I, in my own treatment with him, expressed my skepticism from time to time about orgone energy, its existence, its nature, its functions, and so on, to my surprise, he absolutely welcomed the skepticism. And he told me not only did he think it was good that I was expressing it, but that all of us, including him, shared it. And I think this was characteristic of him, that this total honesty and directness that he had was something that he valued in other people, kind of a simplicity and a lack of pretentiousness. And I had the feeling that he was actually very happy to hear that one of his patients, but his students, had this skepticism. I had a sense about him that he is almost paradoxically, he was so, for me at any rate, he was so closely identified with Reich, and for him, Reich's work and the relationship with Reich was clearly not only a defining thing for him, but it was, in some sense, it was everything, his professional life, his way of thinking. And yet, one also got the feeling that he felt a gulf between himself and Reich. That he told me more than once that he felt that Reich was different from the rest of us, and that Reich had some qualities in his character or in his ability to grasp nature or whatever it was, or maybe in his courageousness, which Dr. Sobey felt that the rest of us, speaking for himself, didn't have. And I thought that was also very striking, and it had something to do with this lack of pretentiousness and his honesty about it. In relation to the seminar, which started out as a seminar. When I started the seminar, I was still not practicing orgone therapy at that point. I was still a beginning resident. And so the seminar started out as a theoretical seminar. Only later on became a clinical seminar where people would present cases and clinical problems. And I forget exactly at what point Dr. Rayfield joined the seminar, but we invited him to join it, I think, after it had already started. And it's true that there was a kind of a clash between Sobey and Rayfield. And from my own particular perspective, which of course is biased because Dr. Sobey was only my therapist and my teacher and all that, but as I saw it, Dr. Rayfield did not share Dr. Sobey's lack of pretentiousness, and he did not share his acceptance of the fact that Reich had created something which was hard to go beyond. And Dr. Rayfield had this kind of, and he would frequently break into a discussion with some kind of an urgent need to complain that we couldn't go any further, that we weren't getting recognition. And if I'm not mistaken, I don't think this was a fantasy, this was my fantasy. At one point, he actually expressed bitterness that Dr. So-and-so, I forget who it was, had been on the Johnny Carson show. And why didn't we get on the Johnny Carson show? Why didn't we have a platform to present orgonomy to the world? And Dr. Sobey was exactly the opposite. He didn't want to present orgonomy to the world. And sometimes you wonder whether he didn't want to present it to you. So you got more the feeling he wanted you to discover it for yourself. To discover whatever you say, whatever works, whatever ideas you could get out of Reich's writings, which were valuable, and whichever ideas you could show to be wrong. Not that he ever found any of it to be wrong, but he certainly was welcoming of healthy skepticism, as was Reich, as far as we can tell, himself. So I think that some of the fractures within that group that surrounded Reich had to do with different temperaments, different personalities, and different views of how they fit in with Reich's work, and how they carry it on.
As I think, in line with that, I think Dr. Sobey was very, matter of fact, he had said to me a number of times that he felt that getting on platforms or getting up and speaking out for orgonomy usually led to more misunderstandings and more problems because 9/10 of the times the individuals who got up there, including myself, we often criticized, my, at times when I had grandiose plans of setting up this kind of program or going on this show or that show, he'd say, all you're going to get is a lot of misunderstandings. You're not going to get the kind of adulation that you think you're going to get, or the kind of acceptance for orgonomy that you think you're going to get. So I think there was a real, a genuine difference. I think also, in fairness, I think here to Dr. Rayfield, Dr. Rayfield was also a scholar whose approach towards, I think, orgonomy in many ways has remained much more scholarly, much more historical in certain ways. Dr. Sobey was always impressed with Dr. Rayfield's ability to write about, in some sense, Dr. Sobey, because of who he was always impressed with people who could sit down and write about it, or organize it, in any way. And that was something that he didn't do, although the few pieces of writing that exist were quite good. A number of clinical studies, but he would say to that was that the only reason I did it was because Dr. Reich ordered me to do it. He said it was a misery, and I didn't want to do it.
I remember specifically his telling us that he had stopped using the doorbuster because he felt that he couldn't really use it correctly. That in his hands, it just didn't seem to work.
Or that he didn't know really what was going. He would get results, but he didn't know what to do. He had no way of quantifying. He couldn't organize it. And he said the only person he knew who had really, that in his experience, who had been able to organize it and hold it and have some sense of where it was going, what it was doing, was Reich. And and certainly in terms of my personal experience working with the doorbuster accumulators in treatment a little bit that we've done, there is that sense that something happens. There is clearly something going on. And anyone who's experienced it or worked with it knows that something's happening. What doesn't really exist are individuals, or is a basis that I see for quantifying it, organizing it, beginning to really understand it in some sort of broad-based scientific and clinical way. And whether that will happen remains to be seen. But clearly, I think one of the anecdotes that always struck me, I mentioned it at the memorial for Dr. Sobey, but I think it's important here in terms of understanding somewhat of the way Dr. Sobey worked, was the response that Reich had, or the comments that Reich evidently, what I've pieced together over the years is that Reich made certain sort of pithy and very, very accurate comments about the different people who worked with him. And you can pick them up in bits and pieces from talking to people who knew. But I won't go into all of them. But anecdotally, what he said of Sobey, and I saw the letter actually, was that Dr. Sobey was one of the best that he trained and one of the best clinicians that he had encountered, but that he didn't know it and never felt comfortable with it. And that was the sense that I had, is that mostly he would say he just didn't know enough. You know, you tell him, oh, you did this was great, you did, you know, and you say, well, I said, basically, I'm not sure I knew what I was doing. You know, he would look back sometimes at things that he did, these studies, for instance, brilliant studies. If you read them, I have copies, anyone wants them, from the old journal of tuberculosis. He did a lot of very, very dynamic work on the treatment of tuberculosis ergonomically. He tells two anecdotes. One is, he couldn't figure out what was going on at one point, so we went to Reich, and Reich looked at him and said, I don't know anything about tuberculosis. That's why I asked you to do the work. You're the expert on tuberculosis. You know more about tuberculosis than I do. You got to tell me. And he said he remembers going back saying, oh my God, what am I going to do? You know, and that sense. And he did a lot of work. And the other thing was that he would look back at it and say, I can't believe that we were crazy enough to do the things that we did. You know, he said, we experimented with this, we treated this condition. He said, often got great results. He said, but today, we wouldn't even think of undertaking these things. And I remember once talking to Dr. Rayfield about cancer treatment, and he's saying, you know, in those days, you did it, and somehow you felt, you know, even though you knew there were risks, you just did it. And part of it was Reich's presence in the sense that, you know, of the movement going on. And today it would just be very, very daunting to undertake against, you know, given the climate and the system, that kind of active scientific investigation. But again, I think that plays back to what we lose historically, is the sense of energy that that was really bristling among a lot of the younger and a lot of even the older guys. Keep in mind, a lot of the guys that Dr. Sobey mentions on the beginning of this tape, Dr. Duval, Dr. Rayfield, Dr. Baker particularly, a number of them, were already well established. Some of them were very successful. There was Dr. Willie, who came to here, was already extremely successful, I think, surgeon. I'm not sure what his specialty was, but these were guys who had considerable careers and came because they really were, again, as Dr. Sobey said, not satisfied with what was available, and they found in what Reich was presenting some new kind of direction that really excited them and lit a fire. And I think that was very, very central to that period. And in some sense, I always felt that kept Dr. Sobey alive, in touch with the work, even as he went on for years in relative isolation. Towards the end, I used to say, when people ask you what you do, we had this conversation, what do you tell them? He said, I used to tell them I was a psychiatrist or a neuropsychiatrist, but then they would always ask me my discipline, and then it would get complicated. I didn't know what to tell them. So he said that in the last few conferences that he went to, medical conferences, he would just tell them, I'm a GP. So and the conversation would stop. They had nothing to ask him because they figured he didn't know anything. So it just sort of kept them away from it. But again, I think that was very, very much his style, you know, and again, that's pretty much about as much as I have to say historically about the work or about my involvement with Dr. Sobey. He always felt, he himself personally loved, as we all know, loved history. I mean, he liked to read and keep up with it and things like that. On the other hand, he would always, I think that had more to do with my structure, he would always tease me about, why are you putting this together? Why do you have to have a history of what Sobey said? Who's going to care? So I said, well, we'll put it on the record, and let time tell. And so he sort of shrugged and said, he had that judgment. Okay. And yet, I mean, the social interaction. I mean, those of you, many of you here had attended his lectures, and clearly, as he got rolling, he could warm up to the whole idea, and I think he loved also the interaction. The sense I always got was that he also saw the interaction socially as part of what the energy was also about. He always told me there were many ways. There was the other thing. There were many ways. There were some sessions I can remember personally where we wouldn't do any physical work. We would just talk. And I would walk out feeling as if there had been a lot of energy moving, and I would say to him, I don't understand, you didn't do anything today. He said, yes, we did. There was contact in the talking. And if it was genuine contact in the talking, then that moved energy. It seemed to me an incredibly real lesson, that there were many, that wasn't one way. He told one anecdote about, he said he was never, again, his personality was never strong enough to deal with Reich in that way. I thought it was very touching. Of going to Reich, everyone had the fantasy of being able to be close to Reich, and he came into Reich's office, I think he told us at a seminar, and Reich said, no, don't lie on the couch. We're sitting down, and Reich put on some favorite piece of music, I think some Beethoven. They sat for the time, here comes the storm, listening, and for the whole session. And then Reich said, wasn't that wonderful? And Sobey said, yeah, but walked out. He just didn't know what to make of it all, because this wasn't what he assumed. And then Reich later said to him, he said, you've wanted that kind of interaction with me, but this has to do more with what you can really, you weren't able to really enjoy it, were you? Because you were thinking too much about what it was like to be with me. A similar thing, he loved to tell the anecdote, at least to me, I think a few others, at the end of one of the seminars in Forest Hills, don't fall out, David. Well, it'll be on the tape. I'll just speak louder. Anyway, at the end of one of the seminars in Forest Hills, when all the doctors were leaving, and Dr. Sobey would say that they would go out usually afterwards and socialize and have a gathering, usually at some local pub. And they would always ask Dr. Reich if he wanted to come, and he would always say, no, I have too much work to do. Reich evidently picked up on the fact that they felt that Reich wasn't being a good team, he wasn't being social, supportive. And finally one night Reich said, look, if you guys really want to hang out with me, or something to that equivalent, he said, you're all welcome to stay here. I'm going to be working for the next 10 hours in the laboratory. I could use a lot of help, and you could have a chance to be with me, and we could all socialize. He said, anybody want to stay? And he said, and they all had reasons for leaving. He said, okay. He said, we don't have to bring this up again, do we? And again, I think as Dr. Weitzer said, one of the other favorite anecdotes of Reich that Sobey always told was the line of Reich. He said to Dr. Sobey, he said, and it's been quoted from other people, so obviously Reich used this a number of times. He said, I've always looked to be with eagles, and all I've ever found to be with is chickens. And so we said, and that was true, he said, for all of us, and he included himself. The one thing I always was very, very struck with, he would be critical and make comments about people he knew and that had been involved in the work, and yet he never discounted the criticisms towards himself. He always felt that he himself was not up to the kinds of demands that Reich and had set, and that never had the kind of, he felt clearly he never had the kind of courage or the specific kind of structure, as Dr. Weitzen was saying, to go the full distance. And he often admired individuals. I know he talked often very, not fondly, but with a great deal of respect for someone like Nathan Cott, who he felt left, and a couple of other people who left the work on very, very good terms with Reich, just saying, I can't. Reich evidently would periodically say, look, if you can't do this, this is hard, and you're going to be more and more alone, you're going to make less and less money, your lives are going to be more and more disrupted, if not destroyed. Anytime you want to leave, as long as you leave honestly, that's fine. And Reich evidently was quite genuine, and those people who did it that way never got Reich's anger or response in that way. Sobey often reflected that attitude, and would often say that to us, that there was no reason necessarily to go on doing this work unless you felt genuinely that you wanted to do it. So I think that was very, very crucial and very, very central. So if there are questions or comments, I think we can deal with that and then possibly listen at the end to the tape of Reich alone and organized.
How did you contact Sobey originally yourself?
That's a funny. I mean, I think we all have our particular stories. In my case, it's interesting on this tape the way things come around. The residency that Dr. Sobey was talking about, unbeknownst to me, one of the people who decided not to go on because he didn't want to not make a living was a cousin of mine, who became quite a prominent psychoanalyst out in Long Island, and he actually just retired as the head of the Long Island Psychoanalytic Institute. And I only found this out years later, but when I was a teenager, I used to hang out they were older than me, and they were more like aunt and uncle to me. And I used to hang out at their house, and when I was alone, I would go through his library. As a teenager, I think primarily looking for books that might have some racy, stuff in it. And I found the book that said "Function of the Orgasm." I figured this has to be the book I've been looking for, and I started reading it and found it fascinating and very, very interesting. And it wasn't anything that I had. It was actually more ultimately got me more interested than anything I think I was looking for, except the real thing, possibly. At any rate, and I remember asking this cousin about it, and his telling me the standard line, which we've all learned by now, which was that Reich was a great, brilliant student of Freud's who had gone, unfortunately, crazy. But interestingly, this guy would say, although his ideas, even his crazy ideas, were very, very valuable and very real, but because of the scandal, which he never went on to explain to me, we couldn't use his ideas actively in our work, and that was a shame. It's too bad that there was such a scandal. And I remember, what was the scandal? Well, he got into some craziness that got him in jail treating cancer, and that was all I basically knew. Years later, when and then this was around the time, by the way, that all the books were banned, so these books that I saw were old copies that had been in his library. When I got into college, I began to find out about the books that were banned at that time. This was in the 60s. And I began to read, and it was around 61, 62, they began to reissue slowly some of the work. And I don't remember the exact year that the selected writings came out, which was the first attempt at, I think, breaking the ban. Possibly, you remember the year that 61, something. What? Maybe even into 65, but it was in the 60s, because 61, something like that. And I remember just starting to get some of the history of it and saying, something has to be going on here. I mean, that's part of my own radical background, the way I grew up. I think anybody who could be so maligned and so attacked so consistently by every corner. I mean, all the leftists were attacking him, this group was attacking him, that group was attacking him. I said, there's got to be something more going on here. So I became more interested over the years And then in the late 60s, early 70s, I had an opportunity. I came back to New York and decided I wanted to find out more about orgone treatment, and had an opportunity to go into treatment. And then went through, as we all know, the routine of those days with Dr. Sobey. You called up, and he put you on his waiting list. And then you kept calling, and he would say, I'll get back to you, I'll get back to you. And then every once in a while, he would actually call, and then you had to take the appointment. You didn't say, no, I can't make it, you know. And so then I got to see him, and that, for me, that was it. And the I had always been a reader and a scholar, and so I got more interested in that. And then gradually, as I got more involved and decided I wanted to do something more specifically, clinically, in some way, he encouraged me. At that time, I had already had a basic background in natural science, because it had always been, and anthropology, it had always been my interest. And he encouraged me. I had thought very strongly that I would have to go to medical school, and I was too old for medical school, but he encouraged me to try to put together in other ways, even though it was harder to get a lot of the basic knowledge in terms of the physical knowledge you needed for orgonomy, but managed to do it, and he was very helpful in that. So that was my entry into it. I think Dr. Weitzner came to it, not here now, but in a sense, also again through contact with Dr. Sobey, first clinic as a patient, and then interest in medicine and science. Dr. Weitzner, won't talk. Dr. Weitzner was also a near PhD in theoretical mathematics. That was, you know, just anecdote to give you a sense of Dr. Sobey's how much he was the kid from the small town in Syracuse. One of the things at the seminars was that he was always incredibly impressed with Dr. Weitzner's mathematical capabilities. So he was at the seminars, especially if we had guests, he would do this thing of asking Dr. Weitzner. He would throw out square roots and ask him for square roots, which is still amazing. You give Dr. Weitzner any square root, he'll give it to you almost before you ask it. He has that kind of capability. So Dr. Sobey would say, it's amazing. And you can just get a sense of him, because it was like the quiz kids, you know, that he grew up with, probably listening to on radio and depression. He'd say, how do they do that? How do they do that? He had that quality, you know. And Dr. Schwarz similarly came into it from that. Actually, Dr. Schwarz came into it also because he'd been involved with the painter Gandhi Brody, who would encourage, a number of people here knew Gandhi Brody, and Gandhi Brody encouraged everybody to go to orgonomy and to Sobey, and in terms of the interest in the work. And Dr. Schwarz was also interested and had studied with Lenny Tristano, the jazz pianist, who also thought that everyone should go into orgonomy. And there is that tradition too, and Dr. Sobey had a lot of artists and writers who came to see him. And that goes back in the history of orgonomy, which I don't think has been looked at as, in terms of it being an interesting article or something, that how many writers and painters and musicians were profoundly affected by Reich's work and Reich's ideas and the whole idea of energy. And I've often found that among musicians and painters, writers a little bit more complicated, but among musicians and painters, an incredible response to the ideas of energy. And somehow that energy is a very viable thing in painting, in music. I always felt that there was, and that always connected with the fact that Dr. Sobey always said he himself always loved music and dancing. He didn't have any particular taste in it. I guess, he had his own interests. His children became Grateful Dead fanatics. And at the end, I was told at the end he was even considering going to a Grateful Dead concert. And again, I think that was also, there was always a certain type of enthusiasm that I think was very genuine to the man. And I think in my sense of Dr. Sobey's approach towards doing orgonomy as I learned it, I think a genuine sense of his idea of how you practice. The sense I always got from him is that if you couldn't practice, you couldn't do treatment with a kind of enthusiasm, a kind of positive feeling for it and contact with it, then it just became a mechanical activity, and it wasn't really worth your time or the patient's time. You were doing a disservice to yourself and to patients. I don't know if that answers the question, but.
I remember a significant change in the way he approached therapy that occurred at the time when Warner experiments he had. Before that, he was, I think, more active, more aggressive. Afterwards, less so, much less emphasis on physical activity, more breathing, contact. But it was a major. I see him before they went out to school at the home and came back years later.
I think that's very true, and after recently talking to a number of, there's still, what's interesting is there are a number of people who go back almost 40 years with Dr. Sobey. You always know the people who knew Dr. Sobey from the old, from the first period, because they said, well, I saw him in his office on Madison Avenue. You could always date Dr. Sobey's patients by which offices they knew. It was Madison Avenue, mean that you're really back. That's like in the late 40s, early 50s, and 10th Street was the next big spell, and then there was the period where I was at 10th Street, but most of us, in terms of the working with him, training was mostly up in Central Park on 97th Street, and then the office down on London Terrace. But I think, in a sense, I've gotten to speaking to people who worked with Sobey off and on or continuously from the early years, that there was a change, and I asked him about that, and he said in the beginning they all felt that you really had to sort of jump on the patient and really, work extremely vigorously, and that a lot of times when he went and would present to Reich or talk to Reich would say, "What are you doing? Why are you doing?" That there was a sense of that the harder you work somehow, the more it proved that you were doing it. But in fact, I think over the years, the sense of that you didn't have to necessarily do. Remember, he once told me in training that when I was we were presenting at a seminar, a particular patient, that after every session I would come out feeling as if I had been through a battle. And he said, "You're doing it. Something's wrong. You're working too hard. If you're working that hard, it means you're not in touch with what's going on. You're more in touch with what you feel you have to do." So there was, I think, a very real change, and it's interesting to see people that worked with him, either as patients or knew him over the years. I think there were changes in his attitude. Some of that also has to do with the physical, your own physical energy. In the later years, obviously, he got tired. It's amazing. You think about doing close to 50 years of clinical practices, and up until the last years, he worked on the average about 9 to 10 hours a day. 5 days a week, and up until the early, I think the late 70s even, I think he worked on Saturdays too. So he worked a lot.
I can't remember where I heard this. It could have been from Dr. Sobey, but I think that Dr. Baker was known for his physical attack. Or as a matter of fact, his patients apparently were known by their bruises. And the black and blue ones. So it may have been his actual influence at that time that everybody was attacking patients.
But I think there were real changes. On the other hand, Dr. Sobey always liked to comment and often reminded us during training and discussions that Dr. Wolf, who was, as you all know, or most of you know, was Reich's closest assistant during the early years and the translator of character analysis and a number of other works, that Dr. Wolf did almost no direct physical contact with the patient at all, worked exclusively with the eyes. And Dr. Sobey always liked to say that you could do, that Wolf, he said, he would often say that he couldn't do it, but that he was absolutely convinced that Dr. Wolf was capable of getting incredibly fine results just working directly on the eyes and doing almost nothing else. The point being, again, always coming back to the thing that and that Reich would always say this, that there was no particular, it wasn't a series of exercises, mechanical exercises. That the other favorite anecdote that Sobey would use as a teaching anecdote explaining was he loved to tell the story of wow, look at that storm. The anecdote was that there were these seminars. There are tapes of them. There were about 4 seminars that Dr. Reich had set up, clinical seminars. And they're very interesting. They're very informative. I've listened to the tapes. But Dr. Sobey's part of the anecdote, which was very, very central to, I think, a lot of this issue, was coming into Reich for a session with Reich after about the 4th seminar and being on the couch, and Reich's opening question was, well, Dr. Sobey, how do you like the seminars? And Dr. Sobey would say very animatedly, oh, they're wonderful. It's great. I can't tell you. I mean, now every time I'm working with a patient, I sit there and say, this is what Dr. Reich would do. And this is how Dr. Reich would handle it. And then Dr. Reich just sat there and said, that's it. No more seminars. And Dr. Sobey said he was like devastated. Like, what do you mean? What did I do? What's wrong? He said, it's not you, it's not you. You're the 4th or 5th guy who's come in here, and you're all saying this, that you're going to all be little Reichs. And he said, that's the end of it. I'm not training a group of little Reichs to go out and sit there thinking, looking over their shoulders about how Dr. Reich does it. He said, you all have to learn how to do the work yourself. You can deal with my basic ideas, you can deal with the knowledge that we're dealing, but you have to be able to know who you are and do the work in a real way, otherwise you're losing completely the point of the work. So I think that was, and also I think there was a significant, I've always constructed, this is only my construction, that Dr. Sobey, I think being the youngest of the group, the central group, was, I think, in many ways often in a relationship to the older guys and how they did it too, and sort of the sense of who they were, their position, and things like that. And I think that, having been a younger brother, I sort of, I understand that and I think those things sometimes played out, although I think he gained himself some insight into that and was able to deal with that. Any other questions or comments or observations about any of this related to the work, or to Dr. Sobey, or any anecdotes that you feel would be relevant? I think that is useful. What I hope to do, and I talked with David Silver, who should thank David for doing these tapes over the last couple of years, and to David and Freya Berger, his wife, whose loft this is, for letting us use the loft and putting out a nice spread, which Dr. Sobey would have appreciated, possibly more than the lecture. When we started doing these things, he was always very pleased that there was coffee and bagels out. But one of the things we'll do is that there are a set of tapes of Dr. Sobey's lectures, and I think with this tape, we'll put them together, and I will give a set to the archives at Oregon, so that it'll be a record. And that Dave and I have talked about possibly packaging the 4 tapes for people who want them, and whatever is earned above the cost of the production will donate on a regular basis, such as it is to ergonomic functionalism or to the publications of the Reich work. And I think it would be fitting if anyone had anecdotes or things they wanted to share, particularly about their sense of Dr. Sobey and his work, that would be a good possible thing to put on tape. But if not,
Well, for me, it always was Dr. Sobey's sense of humor at critical moments. And I don't know, a lot of people.
I think that rings true to me.
My last session with him, after breathing through and talking, and he said to me, well, how are you feeling? And I said, I feel like I've been standing on the edge of the void. And he looked at me really seriously and said, which one? Okay, I give up. I surrender.
One of the things I miss most also about Dr. Sobey is that I've noticed this in my own life, is that he was a major source for me of bad jokes. I'm a great lover of bad jokes. And then, well, I mean, the reason for all you all got, for me, it was part of my experience with him. Maybe he decided it was part of my treatment. I don't know. He always shared, Maybe I was the one who introduced him to bad jokes. I don't know. No, it wasn't recent. His daughter can attest to the fact that it wasn't recent, maybe. That was the other thing, by the way, another, I think, very, very valid anecdote in this camp. Also maybe give some historical perspective on this. One of the great stories that Dr. Sobey told me was, you know, as everybody knows, but most people never practice, my patients, myself included, is the Reich's absolute enjoinder. I mean, it was that you signed on with Reich and you were to never talk about your therapy. That was absolute with anybody, with your spouse, mates, anybody else. You just did not talk about it, you know, until you could talk about orgonomy, you could talk about issues, you could use things that came out of your therapy in your life, but you never talked about the specifics of the work with Reich or with the therapist. And Dr. Sobey had that rule too, and so do I. We all acknowledge that it was harder. He said, but with Dr. Reich, you did not, there was no violation of that, because as soon as you were required to tell him, if you did talk about it, and if you did talk about it and told him, that was it. It was the last time he would see you in treatment. He would refer you out to somebody else. And so Dr. Sobey would tell the anecdote that about a year or so after Dr. Reich had died, they were still all the doctors were still meeting, and none of them would talk. They would still socialize, but they would not talk about their own experiences in treatment with Reich. Right? And he said, so as the year, it was almost, he said, you had the feeling as if anybody started talking, Reich would suddenly appear and get you. You know, so they all sort of sat around, usually after meetings, they talked about everything else about Reich, but they wouldn't, you know. Gradually after a year I guess they felt there was enough distance, they began to share their experiences or what their treatments were like. And he said the most amazing thing, there was this profound perplexity around the table. There were about 10 or 11 of these guys. Not one of them had had the same treatment. None of their experiences were consistent with the way other people's experiences of treatment had been. And I think I always felt, and Dr. Sobey always said, that was what Reich was like. So, and I suspect that if we began to share anecdotally what our treatments, if we were individuals who had been in treatment with Dr. Sobey, would be profoundly different, and as they should be, because the treatment should be your treatment, not someone else's idea of what your treatment should be. So, I think that was But anyways. So I'm always, anyone who has any good bad jokes. My father recently died. He was a great source of bad jokes. I used to bring them to Dr. Sobey. The only other person now that shares really bad jokes with me is Dr. Rothenberg. We talk on the phone out in Seattle. He's a collector of bad jokes too. But and the internet. Yeah.
I had been a patient of Dr. Hamilton's. I actually didn't know Dr. Sobey very well. I used to hear a lot of screaming and banging going on in the next room, even though it was very thick walls. I used to become alarmed. Over the years, I didn't cease to bother me. And I heard that Reich had said that if Dr. Sobey can get a result by hitting someone over the head with a brick, then it's a good technique. And thereafter, I knew what was going on in that room. I'd like to say that my experience, Dr. Hamilton, he rarely ever became angry. But one of the few times I ever saw him angry was when he heard criticism of Dr. Sobey, of somebody else of Dr. Sobey, and it made him furious. He was very protective of Dr. Sobey.
They both were. I mean, they both had this. It was like, as everyone knows, Dr. Hamilton was a very committed ergonomist and worked very diligently in his own way, but unquestionably very different than Dr. Sobey. But they had clearly a marriage of many years, and there were always these little sides. But they were both very, in their own ways, devoted to each other, even though they would periodically complain about each other, particularly about how many paper towels were used, and how many sheets were being. There are all these interesting things I often point out. Part of the history, when you look at history, sometimes is the use of sheets in origami, for the couch. And Dr. Sobey told me that and this is interesting, and always kinds of things that interest me often historically. When you saw Dr. Reich, you brought your own sheet for the couch and kept it in a bag. And you would bring it, and when it got too dirty, you would, take it home and get it washed and bring another one. And then over the years, Dr. Hanlon and Dr. Sobey used a linen service, and they would, when I first got involved, they would just use one sheet after another. And then Dr. Schwartz, many of you don't know, was my generation, my partner, who was, to say the least, interested in financial costs, sat down one day and calculated how much a week we were spending, all of us, on linen service. And when we told Dr. Sobey, he said, "I can't believe it, that much?" And from that point on, we all started using one sheet for preparation, and then we don't have them washable, we keep them. So there are these kinds of sense of the way people interacted around the simplest things that were genuine. And I think you could have a sense of how people worked. I mean, Dr. Sobey used to complain that with the sheets, that Dr. Handman never liked to get the sheets ready for the, in the laundry bag. He didn't like to do the physical labor of picking it up. So he would always complain that he had to always get the sheets ready for these kinds of things. I mean, I think that in a sense, it gets a sense of the human. It also has something to do with a sense of the reality of the history, that people live their lives, they're not just in one particular role, and they bring their character. So we always say that everyone brings their character structure into it, for better or worse.
You can't be affirmative, but I had a very funny Dr. Handling story. Down on 10th Street, when I was waiting for my session, Dr. Handling would often come out.
Because he worked on the half hour,
Yes,
as
right.
opposed to
And
the hour.
He would chat. He was always very friendly.
Right.
And he would chat. And one conversation that I'll never forget, he told me about a trip he made throughout Europe. And he had gotten a pair of these black Japanese sandals, these cloth things with rubber on bottom. He says they were perfect. That's all he took with them throughout Europe, because he could wear them out as dress because they were black, and he wore them every day.
Yeah.
That conversation stuck with me for 4 years.
And that was the kind of thing that Dr. Hanlon would love. And he would love to find some sort of very functional thing that and he would be amazed at that.
That's why I didn't buy the office of 10th Street, because Hannah didn't want to take the investments. I think.
Right. Well, that is a sore point. Dr. Sobey was furious about that. That was the famous. Dr. Hanlon was angry at the co-op board on 10th Street because they originally wouldn't let them buy in, and so when they finally tried to raise money for some project in the co-op on 10th Street, Dr. Sobey said, "It's a good deal. Let's buy it." And Dr. Hanlon said, "I'll never give in to them." And then they moved uptown, and as soon as they got uptown, Dr. Hanlon would say, "We should have bought in." And then Dr. Sobey would become, he'd say, "How can he be that?" Anything else? Or any questions, more possibly specifically to the history, as much as I know of it, or... So speak up so we can get on.
Meeting Dr. Wright, which was, Dr. Sobey put me out to a training seminar, maybe 2 months after I started therapy, in 1949.
Oh, so you were back on Madison Avenue.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And there were about, I don't know, a dozen or 15 more doctors around, and Dr. Rice was there. And I felt transparent. And also, they took a kindness, and his responses to questions and statements that different doctors made. Well, I was not really that in the country, that was in me, I guess. Seemed very sensible and clear. But what really got me was around that time, Life magazine had a Christmas season front cover of God touching whoever it was.
Michelangelo, right?
And I looked up Dr. Wright, and flip flop that I told my God, you know. And that's the thing, you know, I told her for Sobey with it, I worked on me to make sure that that wasn't what I really believed.
Well, the sense of seeing it as God, always seeing him as God,
Yeah.
and, you know, and the
Well,
sense,
it's a look, as much as anything else.
and the sense also of how Reich himself, if you listen to the tapes of those seminars, and then I talked to other people who knew him, had a very, very good way of always undercutting people's tendency to mythologize or mystify. You know, one of the great anecdotes about being presented when patients, Dr. Sobey would say occasionally you would bring a patient to a seminar, a clinical seminar. He said, of course, all the patients were lining up. They were perfect. He had no trouble getting a patient to go to meet Dr. Reich because everybody wanted to be there. He said, but Reich was always, the descriptions, and if you listen to the tapes of Reich, the genuineness, even on the tapes, what comes through is an extreme contactfulness and respectfulness. But Dr. Sobey said a very funny thing when he would come in and work. Reich would work with a patient for a little while and do something and get a very real effect. And of course, the doctor who had brought the patient in was bringing him because there was a problem. There was someplace that something they couldn't accomplish. So you would sort of sit there and say, how does he do it? You know, why can't I do that? You know, and he said when it came up in a meeting, Reich specifically said, he said, look, what takes you guys 20 sessions to do, I can do in 20 minutes. But it was said with absolute honesty. It wasn't like I'm better than you, you know, I'm special, you guys are in common. He just said that it was always said in the sense that he had particular qualities, and also knowledge. He developed the techniques, he understood it, he was much more in touch with it. He was less concerned about getting to where Reich was because he was there. As Dr. Weitzner said, it was always that sense of, you know, don't make, you know, you do the best you can. You know, that Reich was in some way, you know, that Dr. Sobey did feel that Reich was somehow very different than most of the other guys around him.
There's a sense of humility in his response to doctor's statements and questions. Basically, when they would say, how could he be in therapy with all the mixture of things, like would say, don't worry about that, he's there. You know, or somebody would propose some treatment thing, and he would say, well, we're criticizing medicine. And I said, it's not until you can do better. You know, don't put that down.
Always that. Unless you have something very, very concrete, and Dr. Sobey remained absolutely committed to that. I would, at times, once when I was doing my psychoanalytic training, was complaining about some guy who was arguing about the Oedipus. I had a teacher who was absolutely, almost fanatically committed to the Oedipus, you know, complex as an absolute biological reality, and I had all this evidence to demonstrate to him how wrong this was, and I was arguing with him, and Dr. Sobey really tore into me and said, stop it. First of all, you weren't invited into this institute that you're going to argue with them. You were invited there to study, to learn what they had to teach. Learn what they have to teach. If you want to disagree with it later. Write your findings, you know, make your arguments later. Don't go in there and fight. You're not fighting, you know, for a cause. Just, you know, again, it was always that sense of, you know, just be as, you know, that you're not serving the work by being a crusader.
One of the things that struck me for many, many years when I started working with Dr. Sobey was the way he would come out with a comment that seemed to me to be absolutely out of left field, and in ways that I would never consider looking at the situation. And one anecdote that has stuck with me. Some time ago, I was complaining to him about a girl that I was attempting to start a relationship with. And I was saying, you know, and she does this, and why does she do that? And why is she late all the time? And why does she break late? And he looked at me and very seriously, after a minute, said, because she's nuts about it. I like when I was like, oh, I never thought of that.
No, I mean, I think most people who knew Dr. Sobey, both as patients or interacted with him or studied with him, were always, you know, sort of struck by that ability to make a comment, often, and not a very clinical comment or a descriptive comment, often just a an aside or a quick take on something that would just sort of catch you off guard and suddenly put you very much in touch with what was in your own behavior. And that's the sense that I got also of, I mean, that was Dr. Sobey's particular way of working. And obviously, to some extent, there was Reich's, had some of that quality. You can hear at times in Reich, on tapes of Reich, where he would simply ask a few questions of a patient and then ask a question that cut right to the central issue that he had obviously just, the few questions he had asked and the observations allowed him to, there are a huge number of stories. I mean, for me in my own treatment, in the first session, things were just one question after another, and then he asked, then all of a sudden he asked me one question that was like right to the heart of everything I had come there about, and I walked out really trying to figure how would he know that and again, he was in touch with it. I think the issue was contact and touch. A lot of times you walked out hating him or feeling a lot of angry feelings because of but that was part of it too.
Dr. Sobey commented to me one time about how amazing it was to watch Dr. Reich, and he said it was almost like, in treating someone, and he said it was almost like watching a hot knife cut through butter.
Right.
He used that.
Bob?
Oh, well, just something about contact. I've been thinking about it. You just said it again about contact. It's all about contact. I mean, when you talk about energy, anybody can hold on energy. It's like somehow energy is the mechanics of it. That's not the right word, but the transference of energy happens through contact. And the whole thing about what you said before, when the doctor's working on the eyes. I mean, we haven't yet really begun to understand the contact, what that's all about, the energy exchange. You think it's all verbal, and everybody's amazed that somebody could work with the eyes or touch somebody, that could work. Because we're almost, I feel, maybe just speaking for myself, I'm kind of, whether it's completely ignorance or just learning about it, what this means to have contact with other. So these guys, whether it's Sobey, all of these guys that were really professionals, but in the sense of like a craftsman. They're carpenters. They learned about this contact, and they were able to use it and say these things because that was their tools of their trade.
Yeah, and Dr. Sobey would say that what Reich would say to them when you say, "Oh, how come I can't do this?" And you say, "Just give it time. It'll take 10 years. You'll learn how to do it." And I think there's a sense of that. But that's also part of the problem, I think, that many younger people coming in to this kind of field or interested in this are faced with the fact that it is not, that the appeal of mechanistic medicine or mechanistic science, and I don't mean that in a pejorative sense, is just simply that there's a lot, there's a lot you can learn and get immediate reaction from, so that it puts you in touch with the immediate result. The kinds of things we're talking about take a lot longer to gain and get to, and it's a question of, it gets back, sort of comes around full pace to the idea of what Sobey says in the beginning of, Reich says, these guys go to see Reich, and it's a question of, I would study with him if I didn't want to earn, a lot. And by the way, Dr. Sobey, and he would often come with Dr. Reich, was not negative about people who decided that what they wanted to do was have a good living, raise families, and work professionally, provided they were honest about that. What Reich evidently got angry about, and what Dr. Sobey often got angry about, were people who said they wanted to do this work but wanted to get there real quick so they could start, getting the money. And he said, and that wasn't about, do other things if you want to do that. He certainly wasn't opposed to people making good amounts of money. I mean, that was not his object.
About 3 or 4 years ago, I got this solicitation for the college of Donald. Somehow I owned the mailing list, and I looked at it as a curiosity. So I wrote him a letter, and I said, you know, that's all very well and good, but I want to, while you're out of the country, people put together to invite Dr. Sobey into your annual meeting and apologize for him, and blah, blah, blah. I was really taken up by this thing, so I then told Sobey, and in fact, he said, Pepper, don't, you know, stick with it, do it easily about it.
I mean, Dr. Sobey, had been asked on a number of occasions. There was and this is the last anecdote I will tell historically. I was in the office. A list came out from the College of Orgonomy about, it must have been a good 12 years ago, listing all of the approved orgonomists, authorized orgonomists that were known or that they felt, and not, of course, on this list. There were some conspicuous absences. Dr. Raphael wasn't on the list, Dr. Sobey wasn't on the list, and Dr. Handelman was. And that was the one time I saw Dr. Handelman. I didn't speak to Dr. Raphael about it, but I suspect he probably felt the same way. Dr. Handelman and Dr. Sobey become irate. And the reason they were irate was they didn't care about making the list. It was that the list said that these were the only orgonomists. They didn't care about whether they said these are our only orgonomists. It was the idea, and remember Dr. Handelman and Dr. Sobey both saying, being trained by Dr. Reich doesn't qualify us as orgonomists. It was the most absurd, and it was the absurdity. And but then later on, he said, well, he kept saying, I always hear Dr. Reich saying to me, forget about it. It's characters. You're always dealing with structures, and to fight against those things is a waste of energy, and it deflects from the real issues. Okay, one last comment, and then maybe can we hear and finish up maybe on listening to Wright? Yeah. Did you want?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that Dr. Sobey had told me that anecdote of one of the last times that when Wright was in prison and his doctors came to have a meeting with him.
Yeah, go ahead.
Dr. Baker was conspicuously absent, and Dr. Reich said. Dr. Sobey says,
That's a famous story.
Dr. Baker is very ill. I want you to go to New York right after this meeting and see him and see what's wrong and try and help him see what the matter is. And apparently there was something happening with Dr. Baker as early as that time.
Well, the other part was that Dr. Sobey always told me, he said to Dr. Reich, said, do I have to? He said, really? He said, the last thing in the world I wanted to do was call Dr. Baker and tell him that he was sick, and Dr. Reich said, you have to. He said, and if Dr. Baker gives you any trouble, you tell him that Dr. Reich told you to say this, at which point he did this, but he elicited Dr. Handelman's, so he got Dr. Reich's permission for Handelman to come along, and they both went to see Baker, and Baker said, you tell Dr. Reich that I know exactly what I'm doing. That was the context.
Where did Baker get the idea that he inherited the
Well, I asked Dr. Sobey that in this whole business about who inherited what, and he said that Dr. Reich made a lot of comments at different times, and he said he didn't think it was in writing, and I have never seen it in writing. He felt that it's very possible at some point in the conversation that Dr. Reich had said, you should carry on the training, you should run the training seminar. But Dr. Sobey said that Reich would often make, as at one point he said to Myron Sharaff, you'll be the historian of orgonomy. That led to Sharaff assuming, among other things, that he could go through Dr. Reich's personal papers without Dr. Reich's permission, which is historic, for the record, again, was one of the reasons that Dr. Sharaff was thrown off of the estate. Things of this sort. So that Dr. Sobey said Reich would often make, comments that weren't necessarily, but that I think what happened was, it was very easy to say, to take that and build, depending. I think it was more a reflection of what Dr. Baker chose to do. Overall, I mean, I wouldn't even comment on that as much as. Again, for me, and on that, is that the important thing now I think that we can do is try to support the public, keeping Reich's work, the actual work that Reich produced himself, as available as possible. So I encourage you, in addition to making this kind of donation through this kind of thing, to stay in touch with the museum, the Reich Estate, and subscribe to ergonomic functionalism. It's a very, very valuable if you're interested in Reich's work and stuff. And if not, if you're not interested in reading the stuff personally, then make some donations periodically when you can to support the publication of the work, which is very, very valuable. Or make a visit is also interesting and wonderful. Can we hear, this is a tape that is also available from the museum, and it's a tape that Reich made at the end when he was alone. It's called Alone in Organon. I suspect this was a tape, one last little anecdote, is Dr. Handelman was the official, I guess, David Silver of his time, in the sense he was really into gadgetry, and he was one of the first guys to bring the latest levels of recording devices up to Organon. And Dr. Reich was always very interested in it. And some of the original recordings of Reich during that period were done on the old wire recorders, and that Dr. Hammond would bring them up and set them up. And I think this was one of the recordings made on one of those wires that Dr. Handelman, and someone, I don't know if it was David or someone, told Dr. Sobey at one point that a lot of the equipment that Dr. Handelman kept over the years had become antique and very valuable because they were so old by now and historically. So this is a tape that is available. You can order it from the museum.
every single one of them spikes me, interferes with my effort, crosses it out, blots out, flattens out. There's one thing or another thing, whatever it may be, to diminish my effort, to diminish the effects of my effort, to blot out the sharpness and acuity of my thoughts, to reduce to low and nothing, or nothing less. What I have elaborated in about now 33 or 34 years of systematic thinking, and in about 40 years of human suffering, since about 1912, or rather 1910, my mother died. There is not a single soul around who would fully understand or who would not say no to it all. This no is identical with I don't want it, I don't like it, I loathe it. Why is it here? Why does he have to exist? Doesn't he sit down and take it easy? Why did he have to start this horrible experiment which gives us so much trouble? Is he only the trouble that they don't see or they don't want to realize what it means for medicine, biology, and science in general, as well as philosophy, to have this order going? To that, it is mostly a bother, an diffusion of sickness, suffering, and at times I have the distinct feeling that they believe, though they do not dare quite to admit their own thoughts, that I may have gone haywire. This reaction of my closest friends and co-workers to the situation here is exactly the same that has the human race for as much as we can say 8,000 or 10,000 years since patriarchy has ruled its destinies and since the natural law was extinguished in the newborn infants. I shall not go to that, it's all written up in my publications. Whoever knows these publications also knows what that means. The discovery of the life energy would have been accomplished long ago, and this I don't want it, I fear it, I loathe it, I kill it, I flatten it out, I won't let it live or exist. If that had not been in their structures, not in their desires, not in their positive conscious wishes, they're all decent and good people. No, it is a structure. It is somehow in their tissues, in their blood. They cannot tolerate anything that has to do with organo energy or life energy, or what they call God, or what is their deepest longing for love for fulfillment. They cannot tolerate it, and they fear it. They fear it by way of structure. Their tissues, their blood, cannot stretch out, cannot take it, evade it, avoid it, and loathe it. I do not say all this to depreciate their efforts, their honor, their loves, their lives. I say it because it is true, because it turns up in every single move, in every single word, in every single opinion, in every single paper, in every single concentrated into whatever ever had to do with the discovery of genitality, life, love, such people as Lawrence, or such philosophies as Giordano Bruno's, or such great lives as Jesus Christ, and so forth, and so forth. It is a sad, lonely chapter of the human race. I don't feel that I am obligated to solve this at all, to do anything about it. I happen to discover the life energy. I happen to induce or to experiment. I know what it means for the future development of medical biology, philosophy, and natural science. I'm fully aware of it, and in this awareness, I am completely alone. There's no soul anywhere far and wide to talk to. To be able to speak, to let those feelings go free. To speak like as friends speak to each other. This is all.
And I think, you know, in some ways, in my interactions with Dr. Sobey, that was his sense of Reich at the end and Reich's predicament. And the one thing that struck me, if you remember in the last lecture that Dr. Sobey gave, he talked about how when you interacted with Reich, how basically sensitive he was to other people's needs. So even as Reich, so I listened to this tape, the first time you hear it, because it sounds so pessimistic and so, you know, lost, but as I listen to it over and over again, I feel it's fairly genuine quality to it. But all the way through, even as he talks about how everyone can't do this, he's very, very genuinely, it strikes me, moved to say it's not about the fact that he doesn't think these are nice people, or that these are, you know, that he's not out to hurt people's, you know, to crush people's lives, or